The silence in Dr. Hartwell's office was thick as molasses, broken only by the steady tick of his pocket watch and the distant sound of horses clopping down Main Street. Mary Caldwell sat rigid in the wooden chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while her 16-year-old daughter Emma perched on the examination table like a bird ready to take flight. The girl's eyes darted between her mother and the doctor, reading their expressions with the acute sensitivity of someone who had learned to navigate the world through sight alone. "Mrs. Caldwell," Dr. Hartwell said finally, removing his spectacles and polishing them with deliberate slowness, "I've completed my examination, and I'm afraid my original diagnosis stands. Your daughter's muteness appears to be permanent, the result of the fever that nearly took her life 3 years ago. The damage to her vocal cords cannot be repaired by any medical means currently available." Mary's face remained composed, but Emma saw the slight tremor in her mother's hands, the way she pressed her lips together to keep them from quivering. Emma had heard this pronouncement before, delivered with the same clinical detachment, but what came next always made her stomach twist with dread. "Furthermore," the doctor continued, settling back in his leather chair with the authority of a man accustomed to being the final word on matters of health and human possibility, "I must counsel you to adjust your expectations regarding Emma's future. A young woman with such a limitation will find it extraordinarily difficult to secure a suitable marriage. What man would willingly take on a wife who cannot speak? How could she manage a household, discipline children, or fulfill the basic social obligations of a married woman?" Emma's hands clenched into fists on her lap. She wanted to stand up, to show this pompous man exactly how well she could manage a household. Hadn't she been doing exactly that for the past 3 years, while her mother worked as a seamstress to support them? She wanted to point to the careful accounts she kept of their household expenses, the letters she wrote for neighbors who couldn't read, the way she could calm a crying baby or negotiate with the butcher for better prices, all without uttering a single word. Instead, she sat still and silent, as she had learned to do when adults discussed her life as if she weren't present to hear every cruel assumption, every limitation they placed on her dreams. As they left the doctor's office, Emma walked beside her mother in the familiar silence that had become their most common form of communication. They walked past the general store, the saloon, the church, where Emma had once sung in the choir before the fever stole her voice. The memory still ached, but not as much as it once had. She had found other ways to make music, through the careful arrangement of flowers in their garden, through the rhythm of her needle as she helped her mother with sewing, through the silent poetry she wrote in her journal each night. It was as they passed Brennan's blacksmith shop that Emma's attention was caught by an unusual sound, or rather by the absence of the usual sounds. The shop was always filled with the ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal meeting water, the general clamor of metalwork. But today, there was something different in the rhythm, something almost musical. Emma slowed her steps, then stopped entirely, much to her mother's confusion. Through the open doors of the shop, she could see a figure bent over the anvil, but instead of the harsh, irregular beating she expected, there was a pattern to the hammer strikes, a deliberate cadence that spoke of something more than mere metalwork. The blacksmith straightened, and Emma got her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 25 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of wiry strength that came from years of physical labor. His dark hair was damp with sweat, and there were streaks of soot across his rolled-up shirt sleeves. But it was his face that caught her attention, or rather, the terrible scars that covered the left side of it. The scars ran from his temple down to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his mouth and giving him a permanently lopsided expression. His left ear was partially missing, and the skin of his neck showed the puckered evidence of severe burns. It was the kind of disfigurement that made people look away quickly, that marked a man as different, damaged, unmarriageable. But Emma didn't look away. Instead, she found herself studying his hands as he worked, noting the precise control he exercised over his tools, the way he seemed to coax rather than force the metal into the shapes he desired. There was something almost gentle about his movements, despite the inherent violence of his trade. As if sensing her scrutiny, the blacksmith looked up and caught her watching. For a moment their eyes met across the dusty space between street and shop. Emma expected to see the usual mixture of embarrassment and anger that disfigured men often wore when confronted with stares. Instead, she saw only curiosity and a hint of something that might have been amusement. He raised one soot-stained hand in a small wave, and Emma found herself responding with a slight nod before her mother's gentle touch on her arm reminded her that they were still standing in the middle of the street. That evening, As she helped her mother prepare dinner in their small kitchen, Emma found her thoughts returning again and again to the scarred blacksmith. She reached for the slate they kept on the kitchen counter for longer conversations and wrote, "Who is the blacksmith, the one with the scars?" Mary's expression grew thoughtful. "That would be James Brennan. He took over his father's shop about 2 years ago after old Patrick passed. Poor boy was in a terrible fire as a child, lost his family in it if I remember correctly. He's done good work though, very skilled, very reliable." Emma wrote again, "He seems different." Different how? Emma hesitated, unsure how to put her impression into words. Finally she wrote, "Careful, gentle, like he knows how it feels to be broken." Mary studied her daughter's face with the keen insight of a mother who had learned to read volumes in the smallest expressions. "Emma, you're not thinking... after what Dr. Hartwell said today..." Emma's slate scraped across the counter as she wrote quickly, "Dr. Hartwell thinks I'm already broken beyond repair. What if he's wrong about everything else too?" The next morning, Emma convinced her mother to let her walk to the general store alone, ostensibly to pick up thread for their sewing work. But her real destination was Brennan's blacksmith shop, where she hoped to satisfy her curiosity about the man who had captured her attention. She found him working on what appeared to be a decorative gate, the iron twisted into intricate patterns of leaves and flowers. The work was far more artistic than the usual horseshoes and farm tools that filled most blacksmith shops, and Emma found herself genuinely impressed by both the skill and creativity on display. James Brennan must have sensed her presence because he looked up from his work, meeting her eyes with that same direct gaze she remembered from the day before. This time, however, he set down his hammer and walked toward her, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "Can I help you with something, miss?" His voice was slightly hoarse, probably from years of working around forge smoke, but there was kindness in it. Emma realized she had no prepared excuse for her presence. She couldn't simply say she had come to stare at him again, and her usual method of written communication seemed inadequate for a first conversation with a stranger. Instead, she found herself pointing to the gate he had been working on, her expression clearly showing her admiration for his craftsmanship. James followed her gaze and smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. The scars on the left side of his face made the expression asymmetrical, but it was genuine and warm. "You like it?" he asked. "It's for the new church they're building over in Silver Creek. Pastor wanted something special for the entrance to their garden." Emma nodded enthusiastically, then gestured toward the intricate leaf patterns, clearly asking about the design process. "You want to know how I make the leaves?" James interpreted correctly. "It's all in the hammering technique. You have to convince the metal to curl just so..." He demonstrated with a small piece of scrap iron, showing her how careful taps in just the right places could create the illusion of organic growth. Emma watched fascinated as he transformed a simple strip of metal into something that looked like it had grown naturally from a tree branch. When he handed her the finished piece, she turned it over in her hands, marveling at the way something so hard and unyielding could be made to appear so delicate and lifelike. She looked up to find him watching her reaction with obvious pleasure in her appreciation. On impulse, she reached into her reticule and pulled out the small notebook and pencil she always carried. She wrote quickly and showed him the page. "Beautiful work. You are an artist, not just a blacksmith." James read the note, and Emma saw surprise flicker across his features. Not the surprise of someone discovering she couldn't speak, that was obvious enough, but the surprise of someone receiving an unexpected compliment. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than you might think." Emma wrote again. "Do you always work alone?" "Mostly. People in town are polite enough, but..." He gestured vaguely at his scars. "I'm not exactly what you'd call good company for most folks." Emma studied his face for a moment, then wrote carefully, "I think you might be surprised by that." Their eyes met again, and Emma felt something pass between them, a moment of recognition, of understanding that went beyond words. Here was someone who knew what it felt like to be marked as different, who understood the loneliness of being judged by appearances rather than character. Over the following weeks, Emma found excuses to walk past the blacksmith shop every day. Sometimes James was too busy to do more than wave, but other times he would show her what he was working on, explaining techniques or asking for her opinion on design elements. She began bringing her notebook on these visits, and their conversations, conducted through his speech and her written responses, became increasingly comfortable and wide-ranging. She learned that James had taught himself to read and write after losing his family, determined to be more than just a simple tradesman. He had books in his small quarters behind the shop, books on metalworking techniques, but also poetry, history, and philosophy. He had dreams of expanding his business, maybe even taking on an apprentice someday. In return, Emma shared her own interests through carefully written notes. She told him about the letters she wrote for illiterate neighbors, about the accounts she kept for her mother's sewing business, about the stories she wrote in her journal, and the way she saw the world around her. "You have a beautiful way with words," James told her one afternoon, as he read a particularly eloquent note about the changing colors of autumn leaves. "Have you ever thought about submitting something to the newspaper? Mr. Patterson is always looking for interesting pieces." Emma stared at him in surprise. The idea of her writing being worthy of publication had never occurred to her. In her mind, her written words were just a substitute for the speech she had lost, a poor second choice rather than a gift in their own right. She wrote slowly, "Do you really think?" "I know so," James said firmly. "You see things differently than most people. That's valuable." It was during one of these conversations that Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife and undisputed queen of Cedar Falls society, happened to walk past the blacksmith shop. She stopped short when she saw Emma sitting on a wooden crate beside James's workbench. The two of them bent over something he was showing her. "Emma Caldwell," Mrs. Henderson called out in a voice that could cut glass. "What exactly are you doing?" Emma looked up, her face flushing with embarrassment at being caught in what Mrs. Henderson obviously considered improper behavior. She stood quickly, smoothing her skirts and trying to look properly apologetic. James straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and faced Mrs. Henderson with calm dignity. "Miss Caldwell was admiring some decorative work I'm doing for the new church, ma'am. She has an excellent eye for artistic detail." "I'm sure she does," Mrs. Henderson said with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "But Emma, dear, you must consider how this looks. A young woman of your circumstances, spending time alone with a man in such an environment. People will talk." Emma felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest. Her circumstances, as if being unable to speak somehow made her more vulnerable to impropriety, more likely to fall into moral danger because she couldn't call for help. Before she could formulate a written response, James stepped forward slightly, placing himself subtly between Emma and Mrs. Henderson. "I assure you, ma'am, that Miss Caldwell's reputation is perfectly safe in my company. We've been discussing art and literature, nothing more." Emma pulled out her notebook and wrote quickly, holding it up so Mrs. Henderson could read, "I can think for myself, Mrs. Henderson. Mr. Brennan treats me with respect." Mrs. Henderson's face reddened as she read the sharp words. "There's no need to be impertinent, Emma. I'm only thinking of your best interests." "With respect, ma'am," James said quietly, "I think Miss Caldwell is quite capable of determining her own best interests." The statement hung in the air between them, a quiet challenge to the assumption that Emma needed protection from her own choices. Mrs. Henderson looked between them, clearly recognizing that she had somehow lost control of the conversation, then swept away down the street with obvious disapproval. As winter deepened into spring, Emma and James's friendship deepened into something more complicated and more precious. Their daily conversations had become the highlight of both their days, and Emma found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what he would think of a sunset she was watching, or wanting to share a funny observation she had made. Emma began submitting her writing to the local newspaper, and to her amazement, Mr. Patterson published several of her pieces about local artisans and their work. The articles created quite a stir in Cedar Falls, bringing attention to James's artistic metalwork and changing how people saw both of them. It was during a late spring storm that everything changed between them. Emma had come to the shop to deliver a message from a customer, but the weather had worsened while she was there, making it dangerous for her to walk home alone. "You'll have to wait until it lets up," James said, looking out at the driving rain. "I can't let you walk home in this." As they sat together by the warm forge, their conversation ranging from books they had both read to dreams they harbored for the future, Emma felt the atmosphere between them shift into something more intimate than it had ever been before. "What do you want most?" James asked as they sat comfortably in the lamplight, the storm raging outside. "If you could have anything in the world?" Emma considered the question seriously, then wrote, "I want to matter. I want my life to count for something beyond just surviving it." James read her words and nodded slowly. "And you think it doesn't now?" Emma wrote, "How can it? I can't speak in public meetings or teach children or do any of the things that make a difference in the world." "But you can write," James pointed out. "You can see beauty and help others see it too. You can make people think about things in new ways. Isn't that making a difference?" Emma looked up at him, struck by the simple truth of his words. In her writing she had found a voice that was uniquely hers, not a poor substitute for speech, but something valuable in its own right. "What about you?" she wrote. "What do you want most?" James was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames of the forge. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to stop being afraid," he said. "I want to stop letting these scars define what I think I deserve." Emma set down her pencil and looked at him intently. In the soft light, his scars were less prominent, but more than that, she realized she had stopped seeing them as disfigurement long ago. Now they were just part of James's face, part of who he was, no more defining than the color of his eyes or the shape of his hands. She wrote carefully, "What are you afraid of?" James read the question and laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Everything. I'm afraid of wanting things I can't have. I'm afraid of caring about someone who might realize they can do better." Emma felt her heart clench with sympathy and something deeper, a recognition of her own fears reflected in his words. She wrote, "I'm afraid too. I'm afraid that Dr. Hartwell is right, and I'll never be enough for anyone." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their mutual confessions settling between them. Then James reached out slowly, giving Emma time to pull away if she wanted to, and covered her hand with his. "Emma," he said quietly, "you are enough. More than enough. You're extraordinary." Emma looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from years of working with fire and metal, hers soft and ink-stained from hours of writing. They were both marked by their experiences, both considered damaged by the world's standards, but together they felt complete. She turned her hand palm up, interlacing their fingers, and looked up to meet his eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch, not pity or hesitation, but warmth and admiration and something that might have been love. James leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and pressed his lips gently to her forehead. It was the softest touch, more reverent than passionate, but Emma felt it like a warm current running through her entire body. When he pulled back, she reached for her pencil and wrote, "I think I'm falling in love with you." James read the words and was very still for a moment. Then he smiled, that wonderful, lopsided smile that had become so dear to her. "I think I fell in love with you the first day you came to watch me work," he said. "You looked at me like I was just a man, not a collection of scars. Do you know how long it had been since someone looked at me that way?" Emma shook her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Never," James said simply. "You were the first." The months that followed were among the most difficult and most beautiful of Emma's life. Word of her growing relationship with James had spread, and the gossip mill of Cedar Falls was working overtime. Some people seemed genuinely happy for her, but others were less supportive. Mrs. Henderson made her disapproval known at every opportunity, and Dr. Hartwell expressed his concerns to Mary about Emma's unrealistic expectations. But Emma had found something stronger than social disapproval. She had found love, purpose, and a voice that reached beyond the boundaries of their small town. Her writing was being published in newspapers as far away as Denver, and James's artistic metalwork was gaining recognition throughout the territory. It was during one of the season's first snowstorms that James surprised her with a question that changed everything. They were looking at his latest commission when he stopped working and turned to face her, his expression nervous but determined. "Emma," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion, "I have something to ask you." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a ring unlike anything Emma had ever seen. Instead of a traditional diamond, it held a small piece of metal that had been transformed into the shape of a rose, so delicate and detailed that it seemed to glow in the firelight. "I made it myself," James said, as Emma stared in wonder at the tiny masterpiece. "It's not conventional, I know, but then again, neither are we." Emma looked up at him, her heart racing with anticipation and joy. "Emma Caldwell," James continued, dropping to one knee right there in his workshop, "will you marry me? Will you be my partner in all things, my inspiration, my voice when I can't find the words, and my greatest love for all the days of my life?" Emma felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she pulled out her notebook with shaking hands. She wrote quickly, her usual neat handwriting shaky with emotion, "Yes, yes, always yes." Their wedding took place 3 months later in the garden behind the church, with what seemed like half the territory in attendance. The ceremony was unlike any wedding Cedar Falls had ever seen, with Emma and James writing their own vows that Pastor Morrison read aloud, while they stood hand in hand beneath an arch of James's metalwork, decorated with Emma's favorite flowers. "I promise to be your voice when you need one, and your silence when you need peace," Pastor Morrison read from James's vows. "I promise to see you as you are, not as the world thinks you should be, and to love every part of who you're becoming." Emma's vows brought tears to many eyes. "I promise to be your inspiration and your anchor, your challenger and your comfort. I promise to write our story together, day by day, word by word, until we have filled a lifetime with love." When Pastor Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, James lifted Emma's hands to his lips and kissed her fingers gently, a gesture that spoke of reverence and promises that went beyond words. In the years that followed, Emma and James built something together that was bigger than either of them could have achieved alone. Emma's writing gained national recognition, while James's artistic metalwork was commissioned for important buildings throughout the growing territory. They adopted 3 children from various circumstances of need, raising them to believe that communication came in many forms, and that differences were strengths rather than obstacles. Their most lasting collaboration was a decorative gate for the town's new hospital, where James's artistic metalwork was paired with Emma's eloquent inscription, "Where understanding grows, healing follows. Where differences are embraced, strength is found. Where love is planted, hope takes root." When Dr. Hartwell saw the completed gate, he stood for a long time reading Emma's words. Later he sought her out to offer an apology that was years overdue. Mrs. Brennan," he said, his formal manner softer than she had ever heard it, "I owe you an acknowledgement that I was wrong. I allowed my medical training to blind me to possibilities I should have considered. Your partnership with Mr. Brennan, your success as a writer, your contribution to our community, these things have forced me to reconsider some of my assumptions about what constitutes a complete and meaningful life." Emma wrote carefully, "Thank you, Doctor. That means more than you know." As they grew old together, Emma and James would often sit in their garden and remember the young woman who had sat silent and hopeless in a doctor's office, and the scarred man who had believed he was destined to live alone. They marveled at the journey that had brought them from those broken beginnings to a life full of love, purpose, and joy. Their story became part of Cedar Falls folklore, passed down through generations as proof that love was stronger than convention, that talent would find expression regardless of circumstance, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the words, "The doctor said it was impossible." Emma never did pursue treatment that might have restored her speech. She found that her voice in writing was stronger and clearer than her spoken voice had ever been, reaching readers across the country and touching lives she would never meet. Her final published piece was about the different ways people communicate love, through words, through touch, through the things they create with their hands, through the simple act of seeing and accepting each other completely. When they died within months of each other in their 70s, the town buried them side by side in the cemetery, overlooking the valley where they had built their life together. Their shared headstone bore only their names, dates, and a single line from Emma's wedding vows. "Together we wrote a beautiful story." But their real monument was the community they had helped to shape, a place where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated, where love was recognized in all its forms, and where 2 people who had been told they were broken had proven that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the cracks in what others see as ruins.